What's up YouTube? Today we're carrying on with the series on mixing electronic music. More specifically, we're talking about EQ and mid-side EQ. And I want to show you guys why I think mid-side EQ is such a powerful tool. So if you've been following the series so far, you've probably seen me do a sort of more clinical EQ and creating space in the mix and placing all the different elements into their own sort of frequency domain. But now what we're going to try to do is use EQ more as a kind of spatial effect. So let's dive in and have a look at what I'm talking about. So I've got this Serum main lead, which we EQ'd in the previous version, as well as the squelch and this kind of acid sound. So when I'm listening to these sounds, I'm feeling like the lead should kind of occupy more of the sort of mid band. So the frequency cancellation that I explained in the previous episode, it's a sort of monophonic phenomena. I don't know if that's the correct terminology, but sounds in different speakers won't cancel each other out. So if you've got a sound in the left speaker and a sound in the right speaker, you won't have to worry about frequency conflict between those two sources. And the same applies to mid and side sounds. So I want to show you guys something really cool about EQing those sounds individually, either mid or side. So when listening to these sounds that I've prepared, like this main lead and these squelch and acid sounds, I feel like the main lead needs to sit in the kind of center of the track, while the kind of embellishment synths like the acid sound and the squelch, those sounds need to sit on the sides. And I feel there's kind of clash between all these lead elements that's happening in the stereo space as opposed to just the frequency space. So let's use mid-side EQ to try combat that. And I want to show you guys another reason why this studio session analyzer by Flux is so awesome. So let's solo the main lead and have a look at what's happening here. So notice here how there was a lot of kind of stereo movement happening here in the mid-range, but as the sound kind of moved up into the high range, it kind of lost its kind of stereo space. And so, one thing to kind of thin a sound out, a way of doing that is to use like a, Cubase even has a built-in plugin called Mono to Stereo. And you could use something like this to turn the width down on a sound. But watch what happens here as I adjust this. You're almost flattening out the amount of sort of stereo space that's happening in the high end as well. So that's why I don't really like to use this in these situations. What I'll rather do is I will thin out the stereo space using an EQ. So let's open up Equilibrium. Equilibrium has got mid-side processing, and that's why it's one of the plugins that I like to use. I believe FabFilter Pro Q3 has it, unless somebody wants to correct me in the comments. What you can do is you can actually just add a node and then set this to either mid or side. So what we want to do is we actually want to reduce the amount of side bands that are happening in the mid frequencies. So check this out. So we've kind of evened out the amount of stereo response over the spectrum, as opposed to having the kind of like mid-range very wide. And I felt that was kind of clashing with the wideness of the squelch and the acid sound. You know, like I said, with frequency conflict, you've got these different spaces, you know, left, right, or mid and side. When coupled with something like this mono to stereo, and, you know, reducing the width ever so slightly, it's going to even out that amount of kind of width over the entire frequency range, if that makes any sense. So now what we're going to do is we're going to try to do that on the converse with these other sort of wider synth channels. So we're going to reduce the amount of mids in the mid-range. So check this out. So obviously I'm doing this to the extreme, just to kind of outline the power of using this. So you don't necessarily have to do this with your lead sounds, but it's a way of controlling the space if you want other sounds to kind of embellish it around it. You know, having, as you see, a synth that kind of goes all over the place like that, as well as these kind of other psychedelic sounds around it, can sometimes be a little bit too much. And you can get all this type of frequency conflict going on. So I'm going to actually dial it back a little bit because I think we've done a little bit too far here. So let's maybe go 45 and then just not turn this down as much. Cool, so now let's look at these synth channels. Let's mute this main lead and have a look at what these synth channels look like here on this scope. So here with this acid sound, what we can do is we can actually take out the mids in the mids. So let's check this out and set this to mids. So let's have a look at what's happening here now. And then let's layer that main lead back in here. So once I've kind of done that, I like to use like either monitor stereo, or I find going this way, I like to use wider. For sort of thinning sounds out, I like Cubase's monitor stereo, but for widening them, I like to use wider. But something I've noticed is I don't go over, when I'm using it in the mix stage as opposed to like the creative stage, I try not to go over 100%, because sometimes the sounds kind of have unison and all sorts of weird things. And when you start to go over 100%, weird things start to happen and it starts not to sound like the original sound. So when I'm using wider in the mix stage, it's often very small amounts, like 50%, maybe a little bit more. But here you'll notice, like as soon as you sort of put it on and start to tweak it, just look at what happens to the sort of spectrum here and the scope whenever you hear that kind of acid sound. So you see, we've kind of controlled what sounds are going where in the sort of stereo space, not just the kind of frequency space, if that makes sense. So, I think here, what I'm sitting and listening now, I think it sounds a lot more controlled and a lot more sort of everything kind of sitting in its place, which is kind of what you're trying to do when you're mixing a track. It may not sound good. I need to reference, obviously, but this is just an example, bear in mind. So here, let's do the same with this kind of like squelchy, leady sound. So let's slap equilibrium on here, and let's see if we can widen up this sound. Here, I think we're concentrating more on the kind of higher end of things, and maybe even EQing some of the like stereo mid-range out a little bit in this kind of squelch sound. But let's kind of go with the flow here on this one. Cool. So what I'm going to do now is play an example of it with all that kind of MS EQ and widening off on those synths. And then I'm going to edit them and chop them so you can kind of see, a quick reference of what's going on there. This is just a quick example. Again, I keep stressing that, like, this is not the perfect example, because obviously, you got to spend a little bit more time with it and stuff. And these are just kind of like quick references to use. But like I said, I think it's going to be powerful to kind of see the difference, A, B. Anyway, let's do it. Cool. So I hope that kind of outlines it for you. Like I said, quick example. And yeah, like I kind of want to do in this mixing series, is show you a couple of examples from different projects I'm working on and different genres and stuff. So yeah, this is another example. So in this example, I felt like there was a similar issue happening, less of a kind of frequency conflict kind of situation, more of a spatial frequency conflict kind of thing happening, with this kind of main lead that kind of slowly builds in, like in the previous example, and with these guitars over here. So I think maybe the first thing I should do is actually just show you guys, how I created these guitars, because this is another thing that kind of pisses me off a lot with electronic music. People are like, hey dude, check this track, it's got a guitar in it, but the guitar sounds nothing like any guitar I've ever heard in recorded history. So let me give you a quick example. So often I'll hear tracks and the guitar will sound like this, which it's a common sort of beginner mistake, I guess, to make in mixing. But this is also why referencing something is such a good idea, because you quickly pick up these, differences. So anyway, so many electronic tracks I hear that have guitars in them, the guitars will sound like this. And I mean, it's made from a multi-sample library. I think that's Shreddage 2 for Contact. Awesome if you want to make these guitar sounds, by the way. But notice on the scope that it's completely mono. There's literally nothing happening in the stereo spectrum. And one thing you notice when you listen to like almost every guitar in recorded history, it's recorded in stereo. There's either like 2 amps with 2 mics, pan left, right, or something like that. But it sounds more like something like this. So it's super easy to do. That trick is something called double tracking. So I might be wrong. I believe I did it by rendering out an instance. So let's just render out an instance here. And then what we do is we delay one of these channels and pan each of them, one hard left and one hard right. So let's say, for example, we don't have to bounce it out twice. I can use the live plugin channel, bounce the one left and the one right. And you can either use sample delay or time align, or you can use, the actual kind of built-in one here. It doesn't matter, I guess. We're not kind of getting too accurate with it. We're just kind of getting creative with it. So check out the difference now. Super cool, hey? So that's basically called double tracking. Bouncing out another version of it, panning one hard left, one hard right, and then delaying one of them by a few milliseconds, like under 35 or around 35 or so. and the result is awesome. And it's particularly cool for like monophonic synths and stuff, if you really want to widen them up without using too much kind of like modulation type effects and stuff like that. So that's for those guys who are probably wondering, dude, how did you get those guitars to sound so wide? Super easy, and it's actually a incredibly overused technique in recording history. It's one of the first things that you learn at audio engineering is double tracking, because it's actually very simple to set up, in pretty much any DAW or recording medium. Now that we've got those guitars sounding nice and wide, what we can do is we can group them and then look at mid-side EQing this kind of main lead that slowly comes in here. I feel like this lead has too much stereo stuff going on, and it's kind of more present in the mid-range. I think because the guitars are panned hard left and hard right, I'm actually not going to mid-side EQ those guys, because that might, go a little bit overboard. I mean, this kind of phasing was, phase meter here was looking nice and clean. So we are going to mid-side EQ this main lead that's coming in here. So here's something I want to mention about, phasing and issues in terms of mid-side EQ, and that's why I often have this spectrum analyzer, or at least this flux analyzer open while doing this, because here, when you notice, when we take out too much of the mid in the mid-range, it starts to go into anti-phase territory, which is not a very good thing. That can mean that on certain systems or in certain like headphones and stuff, certain frequencies are going to be masked and cancelled and all sorts of stuff like that. So generally speaking, I like to keep my sounds on this side from 0 to 1 and try lean away from this kind of thing here. I mean, in this example, we already wanted to kind of push things more to the mid, but my ear was kind of picking up something going on there. So let's just check this out quickly again. Cool, so I'm going to do the A-B thing here quickly. I'm going to turn off this EQ. Awesome. That's everything I think you need to know about mid-side EQ. If there's anything that I maybe missed or anything that you want me to maybe elaborate on, let me know in the comments. A big thanks to IDM Mag, proud supporters of the dance music scene and my channel. If you like what I do and you want to support me, head on over to my Patreon. The links are going to be somewhere on the screen right now. As always, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. See you guys next time.